great introduction. I don't know that I can do it justice after all the vibrant emotions that you brought first thing this morning. You can clearly tell you've had your coffee, maybe two. I can tell that I'm still kind of waking up. So for everybody else who's joining us, thank you for coming. I don't think I quite realized when I said yes to this, how international this is going to be. So I apologize if there's like other things that are happening, but I really appreciate you taking your time to come out and sort of listen to what we have to say. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me, in case you're wondering. So I've been teaching for about 15 years in both boarding schools and day schools, mostly in the private sector, and all in North America. I have an honors degree in fine arts and mathematics from Bishop's University. So all that purple is probably my favorite color, including my toothbrush being purple at this stage. I went on to get a master's degree through the University of Potsdam, State University in New York, in education and teaching. And then I did another master's degree from the University of Waterloo in mathematics, which has a phenomenal online program and is available internationally. If anybody else is also interested, I'm just saying it's kind of fun. Who doesn't want to do math all the time in their spare time? I basically have reached this point where I'm teaching at an all-girls school, and to quote from another seminar that I was in, it's like all girls all the time. So I've had a lot of time to be able to sort of hone in on my craft. I didn't start off in the MYP or in the IB stream. It was more like AP in the boarding school. And then as I came to my current school, which is Elmwood, I've become the head of the department there for the last 6 years, which is an IB World School. And so I've had the opportunity to teach MYP years 3, 4, 5, and now I'm currently also teaching the DP, the analysis and approaches model. So I definitely can see the continuum going, and I have a very small department that I work with, but they are amazing, amazing individuals. And I can't thank them enough, because they're also part of the reason why I was able to put all this together, because they gave up all their resources. And as a teacher, I think we all love getting resources. That's kind of my shtick by the end of this. All right, so again, as Jerry had said, if you have any questions or comments, or you have anything that you want to say throughout the chat, like I'll do my best to answer as best as possible, and kind of have us go through there. So welcome everybody, good morning. And so to really kind of put it out there, let's start with how we feel. So on this sheep scale, we're going to put this chat to work. How do you feel about assessment in the MYP? So I can tell you from now, I took this from another coaching course. When I first started, I probably felt like a 4. And like, fingers crossed, by the end of this, I'm hoping we're at like an 8 or 9, ideally.
So in the chat, give us a number. What number sheep would you say that you are? Oh, Steph, here we go. We have people who are fellow 4s. There is some 7s, a 3, a 1. Oh, a pi. Someone's using their brains already. Their maths brains are switched on. 4, 8, 5, 6, 7. Oh my goodness. I think we have representation of every number. I don't know if I saw a 9 yet. So maybe we have to wait till the end of the session to get to a 9. Oh no, someone is already a 9. Oh. Karen, we love having you here, Karen. Thank you so much. Oh, look, we've got okay. Every number is definitely represented by at least one friend on this call. So everyone's all set. So let's go, Steph.
Amazing. The 4 for me was probably my favorite one. I like kind of woke up in the morning and I was like, oh, this is what's going to happen, but we're on this. Perfect. So a couple aims for the session. Really, I mean, I think the slide kind of says it speaks for itself. I think that as teachers, we often rely on how we were taught in order to disseminate information. So I'll be the first to say, in my math education, it was pretty much the same that I originally employed in my teaching methods. Give the theory, show an example, do a couple practice questions, and then if all kind of worked out and they were feeling really crazy, we sort of put this in this random word problem and say, like, this is where you're going to see this in real life. I think as math teachers, we all get the dreaded question, when am I going to see this in real life? And at times I cringe. And actually somebody brought it up today, where I'm ever going to use bed mass. So in North America, in order to win your prize, you have to do that skill testing question. I've told all my students, this is important. If you are ever going to win that car from McDonald's, because we all play the Monopoly game, you're going to have to answer that bed mass question. And if you can't remember that multiplication comes before addition, you just lost the car. I've never really thought about it up until like last week when somebody was like, I know where I can use this now. Amazing. So my goal for you for today is to try and rethink how you approach assessment, and hopefully by the end of the session, we'll actually have ideas on how you can go about designing your own task, or at least walk through the process and how you would do it. I think the hardest part in the MYP, or just in math in general, is trying to find those really cool application questions, when the reality is that not everything is going to work immediately. Can you imagine when we're looking at polynomials and trying to find some sort of real world connection to being able to add polynomials or monomials? Like, I don't think that it's inherently there. There is a possibility, but well, if we kind of look at the content, that's the really easy part for us, being able to teach any of those things. As a math teacher, I think that we can all agree that we know our content, and but what we do is we question how we're going to apply it into real world situations so that our students actually get excited for it. As much as we'd like to have everything all laid out at the beginning of the year, I'm that person in the summer that I'm planning all my activities. I know what's going to happen down to the day and down to the homework. I've got it all planned out. But with the MYP, it might not necessarily happen. So if we start slow, putting things together like an assessment task that takes a little bit of time, we'll eventually change things so that we'll get more and more as we go along. My recommendation for all of these things is find the application that you want to work with. Then you can look at the global context and start writing out your smaller problems that'll go along with your unit. So try to have that larger idea of things that you want, and it can come from anything. So this is directly from the MYP, right? How we assess in mathematics. We already know that we've got our 4 criteria. And so we're going to work through those 4 criteria today and sort of look at examples along the way. It tells us about how to assess, but not necessarily the creation. And so ideally, I think we all know we want to hit each criterion at least twice. And one thing that you should keep in mind when you're designing your tasks is that, at least in my school, we've been trying to reduce the number of assessment tasks. And so there are different areas where we can actually pull from more than one area. I find in my school, what we tend to do is we really pull on Criterion C, which is communication, and we add it to something like pattern finding. Funny how the two of them sort of go in hand when we're trying to do all those assessments. So we can always try and combine our criterion, but we never want to go past 2. If we're going for 3 criterion, we're not going to hit all 4 in one shot. And I think for me, that was sort of the turning point where I was like trying to find this great assessment that did everything, and then realizing that I actually don't have to. So we're going to start off with Criterion A, our knowledge and understanding. I think in this case, it seems to be the easiest for us as teachers, right? We've got our tests, we've got our quizzes, we've got our bell ringers. And in a school, we do a combination of all of in my school anyways, we do a combination of all of these, including a final exam sometimes at the end. And I know like the one thing that I think is new, and this is where Jerry and I had like our initial, like, let's talk math, is what are bell ringers. And so it might come as a shock, but in grade 11 and grade 12 for us. So for our 2 years in the DP program, and starting in grade 9 and grade 10, we actually don't give very many quizzes or very many tests, and we give bell ringers, which is a daily assessment. It is one question or 2 questions. Takes us maybe, well, before the pandemic, it took us 5 minutes to do. Now it takes us a little bit longer because we have to upload all of our students upload all of their work, but it is something so that anything is fair game. If you think in grade 10 that all of a sudden what you did in grade 8 or grade 9 wasn't important, I'm sorry, that's not the way mathematics works. I think we all know that math just kind of builds on each other, and like it's a circular thing. So if you've covered lines in a previous topic, we can ask about it at any given point. And so that's what our bell ringer is. It's 1 question, maybe 2 questions. It's sort of like a, can you do this math right away? Can you do it now? And we tend to level our tasks when we do this, especially for our tests. So I've also included the rubric on the side, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, right? And the idea here is that we move through the criterion. Like I said, we've already seen these rubrics, but we want to try and develop our assessment so that we can use it more to our advantage. And so I've provided some examples of tasks. Some of them are from myself, some of them are from my team, but we've developed these over the last few years. There's also a link to the Padlet, which I'll be able to share afterwards, which you can all have. And it's got all of these tasks lined up for you as well. And a copy of the presentation will be available at the end of this as well. So if we look at here, right, sample of Criterion A, all of these are possibilities. So I'm not sure if there's anybody that has like an idea of where they want to go, and like, are you more interested in year 1, year 3, year 5, any of these? Year 4 would be our grade 9 year, but we can click on any of these and we can sort of walk through them.
Okay, everyone, that's your cue. Pop in the chat, which one are you most interested in? We're basically doing a chat poll. I'm going to just look through the numbers that people are suggesting, of which number is Stephanie going to click on. We are getting lots of 1s and 3s, Steph. So I think that if you jumped into 1 or 3, so the number sense or the measurement and geometry, they seem to be the most popular so far.
All right, so well, then let's take a look at the geometry one, because then I don't feel bad sharing your own stuff. And I feel like, although my department is very happy to have this all available to you, this gives you an idea of what it kind of looks like. So hopefully you can all see this, Jerry. Yeah, this works. Okay, so what does a Criterion A look like? So what we found as a department is that we like to level our tests, right, in accordance with the rubric. So taking a look at this particular one, right, and we see the difference in the levels. Level 1, 2, very, very simple, one-step problems, something easy to start off. Or in what we like to say in our classes is something that's going to build your confidence, right? We've been over this material before, and any of these can also be broken down as we would have given in terms of our bell ringers. Here, do it now. Can we figure this out and go from there? As we get to sort of our level 3, 4, right now we're getting a little bit more complex. We're looking at problems that are possibly 2 steps in order to be able to move it a little bit further. If I look at a level 5, 6, here's where we start to dive into more multi-step problems, but making sure that it's still in a familiar context. In all of these things, they would have done these sort of tasks before, right? Can they look at the area and then sort of be able to add it onto something else? Can I connect my ideas to subtopics that are not necessarily in this chapter, but like more bed mass and things like that? And then as I get to level 7 and 8, we really want to try and push towards that unfamiliar. So can you take what you've done and really apply it to more than one step and go further? So that's generally what we look for when we start to level our tests. And my students know we're not, I think in mathematics, the big sticking point for us was always everything was worth 1 mark. And if you did it wrong, you forgot the negative. Now, all of a sudden, if your mark's out of 20, you're down to a 19. That's not what's going to happen for us here, because we're really trying to test whatever skill it is that we're looking at in terms of measurement. In this case, it's measurement in geometry. But if they forget one thing, we're looking at the overall picture of what they can actually do. And so we're talking about, I'm sorry you didn't get that, like, and it was a really hard sell for me at the very beginning where I'm like, oh my gosh, like you did this wrong. I want to take off marks, but it's not about that. It's, if I really look at the rubric, it's actually made grading so much easier. And having the test leveled was like a game changer for us.
Steph, there's some really great questions that are coming up relating to Criterion A. And so the first one I wanted to throw to you was about the requirement to use command terms within those assessment tasks. Do you want to respond to that sort of idea about, do you see it as a requirement to use those command terms when you're creating those assessment tasks?
Meaning the familiar, the unfamiliar.
And the command terms, where that, like, I think command terms to me are always like those verbs or the ways that we describe what it is that they're actually required to do.
What I find is that, and I'm not sure if everybody's both an MYP and a DP teacher. And so what I try to do is use some of them, like introducing it slowly, so that knowing in our school that most students who are going to be in the MYP are going to move on to the DP. We try to use things like find, hence, all of those little ones, like hence do this, right? Or we try to even set up the equations. And I don't know if anybody's seen like one of the more recent DP papers where you're never, like if there's an A, B, and a C, you're never penalized for it, right? It'll be like, show that this is true, and then kind of go from there. And so even starting in grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, so like that early year 1 through year 3, we're slowly introducing that so that by the time they get to the DP program, it's a little, it's more seamless transition.
And I know that because Elmwood is a continuum school, the idea that those PYP students coming up into the MYP, they're used to hearing those verbs of calculate, describe, and really using that sort of language to give them pointers of what exactly they're being asked to do within a question. Is that a fair assumption?
I think so. I mean, it's definitely something we sort of do unconsciously now, right? It's one of those things that we keep going. And I think the more that you use it, the more it just becomes second nature. Sure. I mean, if I think at the beginning, even the idea of leveling my test in order to be able to have it use this similar rubric definitely daunting. And then as soon as we got to it, it just became second nature, right? And it was sort of one of those things where like, why weren't we doing this in the first place, right? We started off small with just the grade 8 class because I have a really great teaching partner there. And then she's like, oh, this is wonderful. I'm going to try this for grade 7. And then somebody else caught on, right? And then we're like, okay, well then if you're going down to grade 7, I'll try and do it with like the year 4s. And then now it's just, like I said, second nature. It's all we can think about because it makes it much easier for us.
Melissa has another really interesting Criterion A sort of question. She poses this question that it's impossible to make a question non-Googleable for Criterion A. What are your thoughts? You're giggling? Go for it. What do you think?
So I'll be the first to admit, and even like in all of my things, that's the very first thing I do. If I don't know what's going on and my students don't, I'm like, oh my God, you should throw that into Google and tell me what you think it has. Not to like give away my secrets, but Math Stack Exchange is amazing. It's absolutely phenomenal. And I like, for anybody who's ever tried it, even university questions, you can throw it in and you're like, wow, I had no idea this existed. We find we change numbers, we move things around. We try to keep the same command terms that we've done before. And certainly it's meant that whenever we look at our assessments, we've had to really be explicit. So we end up making up a lot of stuff ourselves. We'll sort of take a guide as to what we think, but like we're creating our own diagrams and kind of going from there, which makes it a little bit harder. On Google, it's not impossible. Nothing's impossible. Like, and to be fair, I feel like my students are smarter than I am. That's just, it's going to happen.
Accept it and move on. Exactly. I've got one last question before I know that you've got loads more that we need to explore and dig into. But this whole point on leveled assessments, and I think it's something that there's a few people in the chat that are curious about, and it's that idea that depending on if they have a lower level question and it's not correct, but then they get a higher level question correct. How do you handle those sorts of situations when, like, and I've heard all sorts of variations of this where, you know, very smart children will just therefore answer all the level 7, 8 questions and then not answer anything else. Like there's all sorts of stories about those sorts of things. So I'd love if you just take a moment to explain, how do you handle some of that real life evidence that you gather from those students and how they have perhaps approached the task? Yeah, I'd love to hear.
To be fair, I'm so glad somebody asked that question because that actually happened to me earlier this year and it's never happened before. So up until that point, I gave an entire test and they just turned to the level 5, 6 question, ignored everything else and just did that question. And shouldn't you know, they did it wrong. Like I couldn't even help myself. But if we're really smart in how we're leveling things, what I did find with them is that even parts of my level 5, 6 question or my level 7, 8 still included those earlier pieces. There's things about it that are still familiar. So if I think about my measurement and geometry, it's familiar in order to be able to identify the area or like the formula that you're going to need. So taking out pieces of that, it's just supposed to be an extension. If I think about that level 3, 4 question where now it's going to be 2-step or even multi-step, those initial pieces where you're getting to that very beginning, that's your level 1, 2. And so while it's not, I was there where I was thinking like, it's really hard for me not to say like, oh, wrong. And imagine how difficult it is to know that you're at level 5 and 6. And I know this isn't quite an answer, but if for those of you that are from Ontario, a level 5, 6 translates to something like an 80% in the IBSO chart. Like it's crazy. But knowing that like, I've really had to put care into our assessments to know that we're reaching all those little pieces beforehand so that I know that they can still do it. It's that student that if you have all of those sort of exciting math activities, they just want to do the exciting math activities and then they forget about all their other work. I mean, those students are still talented in other ways. And so for us, even knowing that, and students will jump on this pretty quickly, at least at our school, Criterion A is worth 25%. All other criterion are equally weighted. So and keep in mind that if you're like a level 3 or 4 in Criterion A, there's rarely ever a massive spread between your criterion, maybe 2 points on like altogether. So if you're a 3 in one area, you could be a 5 in somewhere, but it's very unlikely that you're going to be a 7 or an 8. And so if I think about it in that sense, eventually students are recognizing like, yes, I can be a level 5 and 6, but it's also really important for me to be able to demonstrate what I did before that. And so it's twofold. It's for students to sort of to jump on the bandwagon and realize they kind of have to do all of it. But also second, it falls on me to create an assessment where even if they're level 5 and 6, there's elements of a level 1, 2, or a 3, 4. So little things like being able to say where they're at, identify the formula, even plugging numbers in at that stage. That's still like our level 1, 2 to kind of get there. So it is possible that sometimes they reach a level 7 and 8, but they've made a mistake in like level 3 or 4. But if you're a 7 or 8, honestly, like you're pretty darn near perfect. And so if you've made a mistake in one of the earlier ones, I have no qualms with saying like, that's a mistake. Like you're obviously not a 7 and 8 because you would have done everything successfully. And that's right there in the rubric, right?
That's awesome. So Steph, I think we're all set to move into Criterion B.
Amazing. So here's our Criterion B. So I'd actually say that investigating patterns, this is the area that I tend to struggle with the most, particularly with the upper levels of the criterion. I find it's really easy in my daily lessons that I can apply investigating patterns within my teaching to get a general idea of where students are at. For me, it's called constructivist learning. Like, I think I just dated myself because that's what it was for me 15 years ago. But like now it's discovery learning. It's the new math. Anyways, you can call it whatever you want. But for me, it's the idea of constructing like their thinking. And so we look for a lot of patterns. So what I did was I would have asked for, we can go through some of these other tasks, but I figured I'd take you a little bit through the exponent laws lesson to sort of show you what I do on a daily basis. So this is the outline of what we generally look at. And again, all of these are available to you. I also have the answers because I like that as a teacher, I can have the answers right in front of me as well as like the guided notes. So it started off which ones of these are monomials? This is a great example of what I give in my class. This was our bell ringer. And they had to be able to look at it, tell me what a monomial was, circle all the right ones, and then kind of go from there. And so as we moved through our lesson, we looked at things in expanded form, different properties of exponents. And this is where we actually had to come up with our pattern, right? So I'd look at the multiplication, I'd look at all of these other things, look at it in expanded form. What's the lazy man's way of writing it, which is as a single power. And hopefully by the end of it, go through example, 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 and you slowly watch your class as the light bulb goes off. And it's kind of interesting. I had one person one student that was like, oh, when I get it, it's like I've been slapped in the face. Honestly, I'll never forget that student because 20 minutes later, he's like, oh, miss, I just got slapped. And of course he slaps himself across the face. Unbelievable what students will do these days. But so if we look at here, this is not this can be turned into an investigative task, but really we're looking at things that are surface level. Could you do it with real numbers? Can you do it with fractions? Can you do it with decimals? Can you do it with negative numbers, right? I generally find we always start off with 3 examples and then we go for as many as they need until they can get the idea that I can add my exponents. And as much as I'd like to say this always happens, sometimes it takes a lot of coaxing going through, but it's at that check-in point so that I can find those patterns as we go along. Do the same thing with division of exponents, and then to the power of a power. So all of these are possible for students to have, and this is what we call our constructivist learning. It's sort of like saying, I have a multitude of shapes. I'm going to circle the ones that are quadrilaterals. You tell me what a quadrilateral is. Right? And sort of going about it. What's the difference between doing it that way, except for the fact that it takes more time? I will fully agree with that, versus saying, this is the definition of a quadrilateral. These are quadrilaterals. Now you can look at examples on your own. That second example is more sort of in fitting with the style of teaching that we would have been taught as students. Whereas if we think about it backwards and be like, all of these are quadrilaterals, what's a quadrilateral? Right? And then they come up with the definition themselves. I find that students remember it more often, and that power for them to learn it's so evident. It does take a little bit more time, but I find that as you sort of chip away, and so my students now know this, right? This is how I'm going to teach. This is how it's going to go. And because some of my students have had me for more than 1 year, they're like, oh yeah, she'll never tell you the answer. She'll just ask you more questions, which I feel is just in fitting with the MYP, right? We just constantly ask questions and kind of go from there.
Steph, sorry, Steph. There's just a really great question that came off the back of what you were just saying. And so with that in mind, do you help the students while exploring? And I think you've somewhat answered that by saying that you ask more questions, but just in terms of that scaffolding and support that we know potentially some students may need more than others, do you want to just touch on briefly, how do you scaffold and support students of varying ability levels?
So sometimes I find in mathematics, what it really comes down to is whether or not the students have confidence. So I'll always start off with like, all right, well, why don't you tell me what you know? Well, and so it inevitably ends up in a conversation. And those weaker students, they know something, right? My dreaded question, and I'm sure many of you get this, like, oh, I don't understand. I'm like, I dread that question because for sure, you know something. I don't know anything. Oh, and being in an all-girls school, I think I get that question all the time. It's probably my biggest pet peeve. And so I tell all of them, I'm like, you know something. And I mean, because we're teachers, we also know what sort of comes later on in our curriculum. And so I can identify what they know and sort of jump on what they know in order to push them in the right direction, right? That questioning piece. I can't say that I knew that 10 years ago. Like when I was starting out as a teacher, oh my gosh, I was a hot mess. And so this like questioning and being able to answer more questions, and sort of lead them in that direction of where they want to go to find a pattern. And it definitely, it's a skill that I am constantly working on, but I also think that my team is constantly working on. I don't have all the answers. And so sometimes that's actually the response that I have to give them. I'm like, I don't really know what you're talking about right now because I don't understand what language you're talking as a teenage girl. But perhaps your friend does know. And so then we'll have like a different discussion about language in trying to find that key piece. Not always easy. But I don't know if that's the answer you're really looking for, right? And in asking questions, you're going to ask more questions and then kind of go from there. Eventually, it's this war that we have with ourselves as teachers. We've got the content and the time that we have to do it, and we sort of have to find that balance between the two of them. And so it takes a lot more time at the beginning to ask those questions and have students really kind of develop that resiliency of like, keep trying, as opposed to giving up. And I mean, so I failed to mention this at the beginning. I've got a 7 and a 9-year-old, and I think I drive them absolutely batty because they'll be like, just tell me the answer. I'm like, well, no, like, I think we can ask. I'm like, what do you know? Like, oh, well, what do you recognize, right? And something like an addition symbol. Well, great. Well, what should that mean? You know, and so we're constantly in that. It's unfortunate my children become my tools in order to get this done. Really. If I want to show you something, again, it's not, maybe we can look at this, the linear task one. This one is a year 3, and this one actually does have all 8 levels. So you can sort of see where we're going with our pattern finding. And actually this one is really good if you want to sort of move that one step and attach it to polynomials. At least that's what I found. So they started looking for patterns, really simple patterns. Can you draw it? Can you describe it in words? Can you look at the next number? And so we talked about all of these things in my year 3 class, right? And then we looked at the next step, right? Could we take it one step further? So instead of it being in concrete numbers or in pictures, we introduced a variable, right? Can you write an expression for the nth one? Can we sort of like move it a little bit further? And so these ones were relatively straightforward. And what I actually liked about this when I gave this to students, I found it really interesting. Some counted the actual box. Like as a math teacher, I saw this as 1 box, 4 boxes, 9 boxes. Yeah, 100%. They saw it as like the number of toothpicks that there were. And so they counted each individual toothpick. So and it's mind blowing. But what I appreciate about this is that with the MYP, the fact that you see it some way different, amazing. Like this was so good. And I never would have thought to count individual toothpicks. And of course that's at least 3 did it. Right. And so we ran into this again, like I see a cube and then I see a larger cube and like a 2x2 and a 3x3. No. They saw individual toothpicks every single time. So when they started to graph things as they were going a little bit further, they got different solutions. Level 5, 6, again, right now, changing the context, like, can you put it into a real life situation and sort of working there. I'm pretty sure that this one we only used as Criterion B, but it would have easily also been a Criterion C for those that would have wanted to. So we're going to move on to Criterion C, I think.
I think so. Let's go.
All right. So for Criterion C, this is probably the one that I find this can be assessed in just so many, and frequently with another criteria, right? We're looking at mathematical language. We're using different forms. So graphs, equations, any of those. And the big thing here, show your reasoning. So you'll see in these examples, these are some of my favorite ones, actually. The opportunity in these particular tasks, it's really easy to verify your results. And what I love about this is that all those kids that think in a different way, like, oh, I could do it as an equation. I could also do it as a graph, or maybe I could like draw a different picture and to make it seem like it works. This is that area that my students tend to shine the most. But it's also the area that they'll probably groan over, because I often end up having two criteria assessed for like any one of these tasks. My colleagues and I are always mulling over what students would think when we're creating assessments, particularly for linear relations. So the linear relations one, that car cell phone comparison, was amazing for me. Our students are constantly on our phones. I'm not sure if it is anywhere somewhere else, but no shame in my game. This is where my students actually helped me to research what kind of car I should buy, because I was then looking for a new one. Do we get a hybrid? Do we get a gas guzzler? Anyways, they did all the research, and then I ended up buying, I still went with a Jeep. Who are we kidding? They're just really fun cars. So we can take a look at any one of these. Jerry, any ideas to which ones, or a poll?
All right, friends, that's your cue. Give us your number. There's obviously 2 level 4s in there. So whether it's the Alice, you might use a different word in there if it's a level 4. The carousel. Okay, Steph, we have got lots of people that are lots of level 4s. So maybe if I know you're passionate about the car and cell phone one. So maybe do we want to go there? Obviously, everyone, all of these will be available after the session. So let's jump into the car.
We'll jump into the car. And then if you really want to see the tibia, because that one, it's still linear relations, but it's slightly different. So keeping in mind that some of the things in this also, how thinking on a DP lens for a second, is that the idea of pushing them towards something else. So at level 4 for us, they never would have done the intersection of lines. So this one in particular is really good for that. That's that unfamiliar context that we're going one step further. And so essentially in this one, did they get a car or a hybrid? And so in Canada, there was lots of incentives. There still kind of is, in order to get, like, they looked at government grants. They looked at the current price of gas. They also, some of them had to, at the very end, looked at, well, gas is moving all the time, right? So trying to find a price to pinpoint for the next 10 years. But essentially, students had to come up with a really small design, but it ends up being about 4 or 5 pages, which as a math teacher seems like a lot, and especially for students. But they had to convince their parents what kind of car to buy them, if they were ever so lucky as to get one. And so they had the report that went along with it that included all other graphs. So this was a level C and a level D. So we included the criterion at the end, but you'll notice that the task itself is actually quite small, right? So they're buying their car, things to consider, and all of these things were stuff that students could go. I find that tasks like these, for those that are going on to the DP, are really great, because in the end, this ends up being sort of like a small IA for them. We're looking at 4 to 5 pages, including their graphs, including all of their citations. And so they had to reflect on what kind of car. And like, we guided them through it. Like, do you go with a regular Toyota or do you go with the hybrid, to sort of make it a little bit easier for them? And so for that, at the end, you know, they found that there was a point of intersection. We'd use things like Desmos, they'd use their graphing calculators and sort of work from there, and then really try and stretch their thinking to find that point of intersection. When is it better to buy one over the other? Right. And so keeping in mind that that unfamiliar context to get that 7 or an 8, this was where they had to show that they could go a little bit further. There's the opportunity to show an equation. There's an opportunity to show a graph, right? And then even in words or in a table. So there's multiple forms that they can use in order to express their work.
Steph, there's a few questions coming up around the length of time that you perhaps give for some of these tasks. And this question did come up earlier with Criterion B as well. So perhaps, you know, if you wanted to take a moment to respond to it. So when you think about the linear task, like how long may students have had to complete something like that versus, say, with the example that you've just given, you know, what sort of time frame do you give for these sorts of experiences?
So it's actually uncanny the way that it's worked in our school, is that because we've gotten rid of a lot of our quizzes and tests, and we've stuck with a lot of bell ringers, we actually find ourselves having an abundance of time, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because there's so much content. And I love to say that I'm super efficient and my team is super efficient, but I think we've got it down to a science now. So for a task like this, I will probably, there's two ways that I've done this. In one way is that if I've already got the task set out beforehand because I planned in the summer and I know all of my work all in advance, I will actually introduce the task at the very beginning of the chapter so that they have time to think about it. They have time to research. They can look at questions and things like that. That's almost my ideal, is that they have an idea. I had another project where, and this was again for grade 8, where we were looking at fractions and being able to say, not that something was necessarily equal, but fair. So we introduced the problem at the very beginning of the chapter with like no concept whatsoever, right? Students are like, I'm like, at the end of it, I spent 10 minutes in class. I was like, what do you think is fair? Or in this case, I'm like, which card do you think would be better? That's 10 minutes, right? They read through the problem, they come up with an answer immediately. And then as we move through the chapter and they sort of learn the content that we want to be able to teach them. So looking at the equations of a line, looking at the slope, looking at, not even point of intersection, because that wouldn't have been taught at this stage. It's just like a really naturally nice byproduct of it. They'll do the research, maybe again, like 10 minutes in class, do you have questions, whatever. The actual assessment itself, I have 80-minute periods where I meet with my students. So I might give them 2 periods to do it. Maybe. They might, in this one, they probably still would have had like a Criterion A, they would have had a test and then give 2 periods at the end. For my students, because some of my students have extra time, keep that in mind. I will try and give them an extra period or somewhere or half a period so that they can get all of their stuff done. It is expected that they might, typically I also ask them to talk to their parents about it or talk to whoever it is and have that generate that conversation. There's nothing better than having a math discussion around the supper table. I'm sure it happens all the time. But I get parents that are like, you're never going to guess what my child asked me today. They asked me about a car and I was like, I also try to warn parents in advance because I don't want them all thinking by the end of this, their students are going to get a car or that they're going to get a brand new cell phone. The cell phone was a huge draw. But the fact that there's some sort of real world application, I find that the parents also really appreciate what's going on, right? Like they can sort of generate that conversation. So in answer to your question, maybe 2 periods for me. Maybe not. If I also think that this is in preparation for what they're going to see for an IA for the DP, I think the DP IA is about 10 hours. So because this is meant to be smaller, depending on how much I'm actually expecting from them, I sort of allot my time accordingly.
Thanks so much, Steph. I think I'm looking at the time and I think we better chug along into Criterion D so we can make sure we can dig into all the other bits and pieces.
So moving on to Criterion D, this is probably my favorite one, right? Because here's where we have those really massive word problems, the dreaded word problems. For those that have ever been in Canada or even in Quebec, they have these situational problems, which are absolutely amazing when it comes to this, because it pulls on all these different parts and it really makes you reflect upon your results. Which is what I like, right? You need to be able to justify, those are those like key terms, key words, right? Find appropriate mathematical strategies, apply the strategies, all of these, like all the stuff that's in bold. I love the stuff that's in bold. All right, so here are the 3. And I'm gonna start off by saying that measurement and geometry one, I actually, to also touch upon a previous one, it's from Quebec. We've sort of adapted it. It's a pool assignment. So if you're going to find it on Google, 100% you're going to find it on Google. What I haven't been able to find on Google is the solutions, which is even better. And I had them myself and we looked at them. But anyways, I tried really hard to find them. So all these are samples of Criterion D. And again, some of these you're going to find that they go into different areas. You're going to use it Criterion D and you're going to use it for something in C. Right? That measurement and geometry summative, we actually just finished it with my class where they had to look at a pool assignment and they couldn't do all of the tasks. But what I did for them, also to show that it could be leveled, was that I did it by day 1, day 2, day 3, and really broke it up into smaller things so that they could see it.
If I love that Alfred, the chat already blew up as soon as you went to a sample page, and we did get mainly 5s. There's lots of people that are super keen to see all of these examples, which you will get all of them after the session. But yep, Steph is jumping into our grade 10, year 5 example for trigonometry.
So this one was massive for us. So for trigonometry, and I think we've all kind of done something similar to this before, but again, they recently graduated from architecture school. Congratulations on this impressive achievement. And thanks to all that helped along your academic success, AKA me. That was where they were supposed to thank me for this one. And so what we had them do was draw a scale drawing using trigonometry. So they pulled out the compass, they pulled out all of the, we had them do all the tools. They went outside, they measured the angle of elevation using a simple tool that they created with a weight, a protractor, and a straw and tape, which I think as teachers, we kind of already seen those done before. And then some decided to do a 3D relief of it. This one was really neat because we were managed to combine this with the art class because they happened to be doing architecture at the time. And so all of these things, which I find in our real world situation, the Alice project that was in the previous one, we combined that with English because they happened to be studying Alice in Wonderland at the time, right? You really have to, it's so easy in math to sort of just be in our little math bubble. But if you can like push it beyond to other things, I try to do a lot of stuff with art. English was my first like foray into this. I've done stuff with the phys ed class where we looked at nutrition. That was a really interesting one. And I looked at anthropology. That tibia assignment we looked at with the anthropology. We have a Latin teacher on our staff. And so she came in and she talked about all about Pompeii and finding bones. It was kind of weird, but that one was pretty neat. So this is what we did. They measured the exterior, all the major angles that they needed. They could find all the heights. I think we've done this in a smaller context where they had to like measure inaccessible objects. So the top of a building, right? And so they use trigonometry, sine, cosine, and tangent in order to be able to get that as well. So that was our summative task for that one. And then they designed it at the end. This one in particular, it was part of a larger project at the very end where I had this idea where I really want, and I borrowed this from another school, but I really wanted us to design a tiny home at the end of it. And so using the trigonometry that they learned, that was like my pie in the sky, my moonshot idea, but that's for another day. All right, any last questions on Criterion D, Jerry?
Yes, of course. These people are so curious and wondering things all the time. So I think this idea about the using of leveled word problems relating to global contexts. So I wonder if you wanted to just speak about that a little bit and I think that's really awesome, Naveen, just to position things within the global contexts within mathematics is really important.
So I find, again, if we go back to what we said at the very beginning, right? Find your assessment, find what it is that you want to do, and then you can associate the global context with it. For that one, for the trigonometry summative, I think I used time and space, which just kind of worked out that way. And so as we work through it, you'll find that there's, I know we're supposed to hit everything twice within like the entire MYP program. And I've been very lucky that it just so happens our MYP coordinator happens to be in my department. So he keeps me on my toes to make sure that we've hit everything within the 5 years to hit every global context twice and like everything else in between. But he does that for me, which I'm pretty thankful for.
And just one more question about the differentiation piece around that, Steph. So in terms of when you think about your varied learners within your classes, I wondered if you want to just elaborate on that also.
Yeah, sometimes it comes down to the complexity of what they chose. So in the trigonometry assessment, in this one, depending on what they chose, that sort of, I'd say, well, why don't you look at this like small entryway? And so I can guide them to different things. And of course, they always want to challenge me to go a little bit further. And I'm like, that's great, right? The complexity of which they had to look at the exterior of our particular building, I have a very, very old building that I teach in. I say old, knowing that there's some teachers here from Europe, which like old goes out the window when you're in Canada. Oh my gosh, like this building is 75 years old. That's nothing compared to the cathedral that was like built years and years prior to that. So in our mind, my 100-year-old school has some really neat different architectural pieces. The complexity of it is sort of what decided are the level at which they were reaching at. But also being able to sort of move it into, did they justify the results at the end? So some of them use sine law, some of them use SOHCAHTOA, and then some of them also used just similar triangles, right? They take the measurement from one spot, they'd move again somewhere else, and they kind of go from there using their own shadow. So all of those are possibilities on how to be able to check their work. And then if I really think about going back to like that DP thing, the DPIA, because that's always kind of in the back of my mind. Have I prepared my MYP students enough to be able to also succeed in the DP? Is basically the whole format of this is what I'm going to do the math, and then justify how it worked. That's sort of where that differentiation in the levels comes in.
For sure. Thanks so much, Steph. Steph, I am incredibly conscious of the time because that's my job as moderator. And so just wanted to we do have a few spare minutes because we do go into a break straight after this. But just that mindfulness of our time and just wanted to just give you that heads up for where we're about to go next.
So we were going to talk a little bit about creating an assessment, and I think like this would be a good place where we can sort of brainstorm in our session. So how do we go about creating an authentic learning experience through assessment? I try to look at what's happening in the news and other things around me. So these are the sort of questions that I ask myself as I'm sort of going forward, right? What's the topic we're looking at? What area or criterion do I want to assess, right? Do I require other knowledge? Because other knowledge also falls into that sort of like 7-8 category. And can I, like my favorite part is, can I connect the assessment to other subjects, right? So you can look through things like puzzles, card games, probability, like all those. Statistics tends to be one of the easiest places for us to be able to find any of these criteria and kind of go from there. Mathematics and nature, what's happening in the community. One of my favorites in year 5 is always projectile motion, because parabolas are just super fun to look at. And sure enough, I had a grade 10 build me a rocket. It was kind of neat. You can look at like the rising success of YouTube stars, right? And again, that's something that they'll be able to model. Essentially, you want to channel your inner math geek to sort of see what's going on. So this is my Alice in Wonderland project. This was a student work, right? And what we looked at in here was year 3, number sense, right? For this assessment, we teamed up with the English department. And this is at the very beginning of the year. So we generally start with number sense, looking at proportions, rates, ratios, and all that other stuff. And we had students look at various body parts to enlarge or shrink them to the measurement that they chose. So every single assessment was unique, which is kind of what I like about this, right? It lets everybody sort of shine in their own right. So in an assessment like this, how can we incorporate the mathematics that we need? So this is what their finished drawing looked like in their number sense unit, right? And so again, this is what I'm going to do. Here's my math, and this is how I'm going to verify my work. So for all of these things, students looked at decimals, they looked at different measurement in different forms. Some used the boxes in order, like provided by the grid, some used rulers. And then we could even extend this further to look at like the enlarged area versus like a single side length. And so some students took it in that direction. As I was working on this presentation, I thought about like working with parabolas, because I've already said projectile motion is probably one of my favorites. And I've really dated myself when I look at the Super Mario Brothers. But essentially, if I look at like the first 11 seconds, I've already seen so much math. It's hard not to get that stuck in your head by the end of this. I can definitely tell you that's all that's sort of been going on. But so this one, great for quadratic equations, right? How can I apply the situations in math? What can be explored? You know, like how far is Mario jumping that I can have that parabolic motion as I go up and down, right? Or even the rate of growth from when he was little before he hit the mushroom and then he suddenly got bigger, right? I did have somebody look at an arrow shooting through the air through a Zelda game, right? So all of these things are things that can be explored. All right, so Jerry, I don't know if we have time for the breakout groups, knowing that we're kind of pressed for time.
I know. So what I'm wondering is that we might skip over our breakout rooms for now, because I do know that there are some people that still have a few questions and wonderings that they would love to dig into. So we might forego the breakout rooms. We're so very sorry, friends, but we have hoped to achieve all those bits and pieces of sharing things and making sure that you get what you need out of this session. So we hope you forgive us for not jumping into breakout rooms. But in terms of these questions, I think, Steph, that when people are going through this after the session, I think it's a really useful process for them to go through with themselves or with their teams back at school.
Absolutely. I would say, like, I guess your thoughts for this is whenever you're designing your task, choose your application. What's the math content behind it? And then what criterion are you focusing on? It's funny how you'll read a magazine, and I found one that said the largest pizza ever built was something like 5 or 6 blocks, and it was in the Guinness Book of World Records. And so you find those pieces of math that you can sort of look at it. If you look at, maybe they really like nature, and you look at stalagmites and stalactites and the rate at which they grow, which is incredibly small, but the point at which they meet, again, this is like a mathematical concept, and then we can think about the content that goes behind it. So we're not going to share out because we've kind of ran out of time, but I'll leave it for Jay to looking at exploring Toddle a little bit more.
Yeah, so I'd love to just, and I think it echoes some of the questions that people are asking about some of the differentiation pieces. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to steal the ability to share screen off of you for a second, Steph, and just show people inside here where basically we're inside the Toddle platform. So for those of you who perhaps haven't been into Toddle platform before, here is a sneaky peek. This is an assessment task that has been created within the context. You can see the overlay of certain examples that Steph has already been sharing today, where this task is a formative one, and it is about this idea of where is the art. So having a cover image is always a nice appealing way for students to visually identify the idea of proposing the duration of time. So like Steph has talked about throughout the session, about how much time do we anticipate this task to take, whether that's in class or whether it's home learning or a combination of the two. We are able to set some parameters around the type of strategy that we're using within a task. So Steph has talked us through some really wonderful examples, some of them being open-ended. You can see some may have been performance. The idea of portfolio assessments for those schools that potentially have this idea of gathering collections of evidence of learning over time may be an idea that some people use within their schools. So then we jump into this idea of the type of task that we're asking learners to do. And again, like Steph has shown us some wonderful examples where, although we think mathematically and the idea of typical forms of assessments, the idea that the full range that Steph, you've done a fabulous job throughout this session to really illustrate the fact that math assessments don't look and feel exactly the same, and they certainly are not just tests. And sometimes very few of them are tests. So I think that's been really fantastic. Your examples were the same sort of idea of outlining resources and making sure that we're quite clear on those sorts of pieces. And then for those people who were asking about this differentiation piece, the idea of identifying which parts of criteria you are identifying. Again, this example of it being perhaps 2 is what Steph shared with us earlier, which is fabulous. And then we get the idea of the actual rubrics themselves. So what's really cool about the Toddle platform with this is, as much as this is our pre-generated official IB communication that Steph shared on the screen, I can click on this box and I can edit and change. And I could be doing this real life in class with my students, that I can be actually co-creating those task-specific criterion points with my students as we're going. And Steph, I know that you are a big believer of the co-creation of you don't do all the work beforehand, you actually make them work for their learning and do these things with you in class. So I really just wanted to share momentarily for those of you who perhaps haven't seen inside the Toddle platform what that looks like. So I'll stop sharing there. And Steph, we are just about at time, but there's one of the questions I just spoke to the idea, and I'd love to just throw it to you momentarily about this idea of students creating or co-creating with you for those assessment tasks. Did you want to just speak briefly to that idea?
So I have a colleague, he's not in mathematics, but he is 100% on board with that. And he also happens to be the head of our school now. And it takes a lot of time at the beginning. And I find like that's where my anxious point lies, the amount of time that it takes to really get my students involved. And if I hadn't have lived it myself, if I hadn't drank the Kool-Aid, I would say like, it's hard. And then at the end, you actually end up gaining more time because students know what the expectation is. I find in our school, not everybody starts the MYP and finishes with us. Like we get entry at very various points. The students that have started with us in our year 1 in our grade 6 program, or grade 7, by the time they get even to year 3, year 4, year 5, it's sort of like, oh, I know what I'm talking about. It's old hat. And then everything falls along seamlessly, but we put a lot of work into it at the very beginning. Those ones that come in at any given time, like I definitely try to spend a little bit more time sort of looking at what's going to happen. My favorite moment actually happened about 3 weeks ago when they finished that pool task. And a student was like, I don't understand. Aren't you going to tell me the answer? And I didn't even have to say it, but another student was like, oh no, she never answers your questions. She'll just ask you more. I don't know if you want to go that route. And so it is like, it's anxiety inducing as a teacher to find how much time is going to happen. But I guess I can say that the more you do it, the easier it gets. And it's about breaking through that barrier of reaching that uncomfortable point. And you're like, no, I'm going to try it. I'm going to do it, and making that change. It won't always be what you hope for at the very beginning, but I certainly hope that by the end, you'll get there.
Amazing. Steph, thank you so very much. We are at time. We do actually have a slight break in the program and the agenda, so we do have just a couple more moments. Just so everyone is aware, we have just popped the Padlet link into the chat. We'll pop it in a few more times because I know there's so many comments that are still flowing through in the chat, so it's been really wonderful. Steph, I think you have done such a wonderful job of capturing the full essence and the deep, rich experiences of assessment in math, and just going way beyond the idea of math has tests. And I adore that about the way you work, and I'm so grateful that you were able to share some of your experiences and expertise with the crowd today. They certainly have loved the samples and the examples that you've been able to share, and just a bit of insight into your practice. So thank you so very much. Everyone, please grab that Padlet link before you leave the call. There will be a short survey for you to respond to about the session. The next session that is on the agenda is a wonderful session that I'm also moderating about IDUs. So I think flowing on really nicely from what Steph has shared today about the way that we lean into other disciplines, whether it be intentionally as an explicit IDU or whether it's just by being smart and talking to your colleagues. But yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you so much for everyone for being such wonderful, active participants in the chat. We have absolutely loved having you here. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.